Hi folks, you're all very welcome to this geotopic session on physics and how the work I do relates to the physics curriculum. So the talk today is entitled Using Electromagnetic and Acoustic Waves in Environmental, Marine and Geoscience. My name is Rory Quinn and I'm a lecturer here in geophysics in the School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Ulster University. So how this relates to the physics curriculum, it relates to units, waves, photons and astronomy, and on fields, capacitors and particle physics directly, but it also touches on some of the other units which should become apparent as we go through the session today. So to put this into context, the human population is growing all the time and we're living on a changing planet. So for example, in 2023, the current human population is 8 billion and UN reckon by 2100, the global population will be 11 billion. And to put this into human perspective, human lifespan, my mother was born in the year 1940 and Earth had a population of 2.5 billion. I was born in 71 and Earth had a population of 3.8 billion. And my daughter was born in 2008 and Earth had a population of 6.8 billion. So the Earth population has nearly trebled between when my mother was born and when my daughter was born. And of course, all the time as this is happening, the Earth is heating up due to global warming. Sea levels are rising due to global warming. Land area is accordingly shrinking. And the resources that we're using are also shrinking because many of these resources are non-renewable by their nature, as in the form on geological timescales as opposed to human timescales. So that's the context for a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today. So how did I get into doing this kind of work? Well, I went to college in Cork originally and to do a science degree, and I ended up specialising in geology, but that wasn't my initial intention. My intention was to specialise in chemistry, and the way it worked was we had to pick 4 subjects in our first year. You drop one, and then your 4th year you specialise or you major in one of those subjects. So my ambition was to major in chemistry, so I chose physics, chemistry and maths because they were my favourite subjects. And then I was given a tutor who was in the geology department who suggested I pick geology as my 4th subject because I might enjoy it, because it used chemistry, physics and maths in very much an applied sense. So my final decision was made after doing an industrial placement with Pfizer in Ringaskiddy and Cork in my 2nd year. I fell out of love, or I was falling out of love with chemistry at that stage and falling more and more in love with geology. And the area of geology that I enjoyed most was the area which combined physics and geology. So I ended up doing a geophysics master's in Durham University in '94, and I got a scholarship from Amoco, which were an American exploration company. And then I did my PhD in Southampton in 1997, and that was in marine geophysics. And so I was drifting away from industrial applications more towards environmental applications. And the PhD I was working on was part of a project funded by NERC, which were the Natural Environment Research Council. And then I was very lucky that when I was finishing up my PhD, a job was advertised up in Coleraine in Ulster University. And I was lucky to be appointed here in 1998. And I've been working here ever since as a lecturer in marine geophysics. So I've been spending the last 25 years effectively working on applied problems related to the natural environment. And the general area I work in is called Earth observation, which is the gathering of information about the physical, chemical and biological systems of planet Earth. And the traditional approach to Earth observation was very much field-based. So you go out at sites in the landscape and make observations or measurements at those sites and then try and extrapolate over a national or an international scale. The limitations to this approach are they resulted in low resolution models when you try and extrapolate these types of data. They're very time consuming and expensive, and also fieldwork is invasive. So you're interrupting the system that you're trying to study in the first place. The more contemporary approach then to Earth observation is very much a remote sensing approach, and this is where we're using physics or the principles of physics to study planet Earth and the systems therein. The advantage of a remote sensing approach is that they result in very high resolution models of the landscape. It's a time efficient approach. They generally tend to result in open data sets, which are open to the public, and also it's a non-invasive approach. So we're not interrupting the system we're trying to investigate. Of course, it still demands some fieldwork because we need to validate our data as we go along. Luckily for us, we've got many sensors orbiting above planet Earth and on planet Earth, and they run through the full range of both electromagnetic and acoustic spectra. So for example, we've got satellites orbiting above Earth, we've got ground stations controlling these satellites on planet Earth, and of course they're sweeping through gamma rays, X-rays, ultraviolet. So we've got sensors on board all the time bombarding Earth actively with these electromagnetic waves. Okay, so for example, Landsat is probably the one we're most familiar with. Landsat is a sensor that reoccupies the same position every 16 days above planet Earth. And this is a profound implication for us as natural scientists. It means that we can use these techniques to monitor changes on a very, very high resolution temporal and spatial scales. Okay, so we can use these sensors to monitor changes in the Earth system over time. And we use electromagnetic waves, and we also use seismic or acoustic waves in remote sensing. Why do we use both of these types of waves? Well, electromagnetic waves are very good for propagating through the atmosphere, but once we try and propagate these waves underwater, and seawater especially, they don't propagate very far. So X-rays will only propagate 10 centimeters, infrared about 3 microns. In other words, electromagnetic waves are fairly useless at remote sensing underwater. Conversely, acoustic waves are very, very good underwater. For example, a 1000 kilohertz wave will propagate 100 meters underwater, 10 kilohertz wave, 30 kilometers underwater. So we tend to use electromagnetic sensors for sensing the terrestrial environment and the surface of the oceans, and then we tend to use acoustics for sensing the watery component of our planet. And this is very important because 71% of planet Earth is covered with saline water, so we need a good remote sensing solution and a robust solution for monitoring that part of the planet. The platforms we use in an aerial sense, satellites are used, the most obvious ones that are used at elevations above about 150 kilometers. Planes as a platform are used at elevations below about 30 kilometers. And more recently we're using drones. Increasingly we're using drones because the payload that we can put on drones is getting better and better as drones become more and more powerful. And drones are usually used for elevations less than about 3 kilometers. In the marine environment, traditionally we use vessels such as ships and boats. They're dedicated survey vessels with sensors mounted on the hull of them or towed behind them. But increasingly now we're using very fancy bits of kit such as underwater robots, remote operated vehicles, autonomous underwater vehicles, etc. And these devices and these vessels can get into areas on planet Earth that we can't get into easily with ships, or they can get the sensors very close to the seabed in depths of 11 kilometers, etc. And what we're interested in terms of physics is the interaction of these waves with Earth materials. So luckily for us, electromagnetic and acoustic waves will interact with plants, will interact with animals, and will interact with solids, liquids and gases. In other words, everything that makes up planet Earth. Okay, and generally speaking, we're interested in looking at the reflection or the interaction of these waves across the boundaries between two different media. So usually medium 1 that we're dealing with is usually the atmosphere or the ocean, and medium 2 then is the target, whether that target is a plant, an animal, or a solid, liquid and gas. And we're interested in the transmission of this energy across boundaries, the reflection of the energy from boundaries, the refraction of energy through boundaries, the absorption of energy by materials, and also the scattering function, okay, how this energy is scattered by different materials. And as I said, we're very lucky that we've got a very, very wide range of frequencies and therefore wavelengths we can use, and we can pick and choose our sensor according to the target that we're looking at. Okay, so it's horses for courses. We choose our sensor according to the problem that we're trying to solve. And a lot of this type of technology and these techniques have got very profound societal applications. So for example, one of the societal issues that we hear about the whole time is the health of the oceans. Okay, so the ocean plays a huge part, an enormous part in driving the global circulation and therefore the global climate system. So one example of satellite we use to monitor the health of the oceans is the ENVISAT, which is run by the European Space Agency. And here we're looking at phytoplankton blooms. Okay, ENVISAT has a spatial resolution of 300 meters. In other words, the pixels in these data sets are 300 meters by 300 meters. And it's got a temporal resolution of 3 days. So it reoccupies each position over planet Earth every 3 days. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the visible spectrum. And here's a zoomed in version of the west coast of Ireland. And you can see these phytoplankton are showing up as these greens and blue colours. Okay. And phytoplankton contain chlorophyll, and that's how they're visible how they're imaged in the visible spectrum. And plankton is really important because it's the base of the food web, okay, and is very sensitive to temperature and to pollution. So even small changes in global temperature and pollution will be reflected in concentrations of plankton in the ocean environment. Okay, so what we do is we measure the reflectance in the blue-green region of the visible spectrum using the Landsat data, and then we run an algorithm over these data sets, and the algorithm calculates basically the concentration of chlorophyll A in milligrams per meters cubed. And we've got that algorithm because previously we've gone out in these areas and we've collected direct samples and measured the concentrations of plankton in these. And this gives us, therefore, one of the essential climate variables which we use to monitor the health or otherwise of planet Earth. And an example of the output of this type of approach, so here's Northwest Europe measured in April, and here's Northwest Europe measured in July from a couple of years ago. And what we're looking at here is the output of this approach in terms of chlorophyll concentration in milligrams per meters cubed. Okay, so in other words, we can use these data in a time-lapse sense to monitor how Earth is changing on a weekly, on a monthly, on an annual, on a decadal basis, etc. Another issue that we hear about a lot in the news is ice sheet melting, and this has got a profound effect on sea level rise, because as the ice sheets melt, fresh water is introduced in the ocean environment, and therefore the sea levels rise accordingly. And one of the systems we use to study this is called ISAT, which is run by NASA. This has got a spatial resolution of 30 meters, so the pixels measure 30 meters by 30 meters, and a repeat period of 8 days. So the temporal resolution on these data sets are 8 days. And here's an example of the output of one of the analysis from this type of approach. So here we've got repeat surveys of Antarctica, and what it's color coded, so the output shows stable areas are in blue, and the darker red areas, the darker the red, the faster the ice is flowing, and therefore the faster it's melting and entering the ocean environment. And you can see the ice sheet margins here are melting in some areas very, very rapidly. That's introducing fresh water into the ocean, changing the salinity of the ocean, but also changing the sea level, and sea level is rising. And that has profound effects in various areas of the globe, such as, say, Bangladesh. Bangladesh has a very low gradient shoreline, coastline. So even a small rise in sea level will flood huge areas of the land mass, what's currently land mass, and therefore it will, the human population living in those areas are displaced in quite a profound effect. Another area that we're becoming increasingly aware of is we've got polluting wrecks all over the world. So here's an example of a World War I shipwreck that we did surveys over using an acoustic remote sensor a few years back. So this is Essa Shirapo in Belfast Lough, which was mined in 1917. She was a casualty of the First World War. UNESCO estimates we've 3 million shipwrecks around planet Earth. That's probably a highly conservative estimate. A lot of these are toxic because when they were wrecked, they contained tanks full of diesel. The warships then contained a lot of munitions, and those munitions contain lots of nasties. So about 75% of all shipwrecks in Europe are dated to World War II. And of these, we've got about 25% of all the potentially polluting wrecks in the whole of the world is in the North Atlantic, so on Ireland's doorstep. And here's an example of one of these polluting wrecks. This is SS Stuttgart in the Gulf of Gdansk, which is in the Baltic. And you can see here, so these are acoustic remotely sensed data. We've got this lump on the seabed, which is basically the shattered remains of SS Stuttgart, and gone in and taken direct sediment samples from the seabed all around the site. And what we can see is when we analyse the contaminants within these sediments, we can see that it's having a profound effect. So the fuel tanks are being ruptured, and that diesel is leaking out, that heavy fuel oil is leaking out and contaminating the sediments and the water column in the area, up to a distance of a couple of kilometres away from the shipwreck site itself. Okay, and if you think we've got a legacy of thousands of these shipwrecks on the seabed around Europe, and they're slowly degrading and bringing their contaminants into the ocean environment. So I was working a few years ago with a colleagues in Belgium, and we were working on a technique that we could use satellite remote sensing to try and detect these features on the seabed, to try and see could we use satellite remote sensing data, in this case Landsat, to image these potentially polluting wrecks on the seabed. Our study area was off the Belgian coast, so this is Zeebrugge. And what we're looking at here is the Landsat data. So this is the visible spectrum. So the blues and the greens are the water column. And then these yellowy, browny areas are where sediment has been stripped off the seabed and been resuspended and brought up into the water column. So it's suspended particulate matter, in other words. So we were able to use an algorithm to derive these suspended particulate matter maps of the study area. So the yellows here and the yellows and the browns are where we've got high concentrations of suspended particulate matter, and the blues and greens are where we've got low concentrations. And of course, because we've got a temporal resolution on these data of 16 days, we were able to get data at different stages of the tide and look at where suspended particulate matter was being drawn into the water column. And if we follow one of these SPM plumes back to its origin, the origin of these plumes is always at an obstacle on the seabed. So in some cases, this obstacle is a known shipwreck, and in other cases, they were unknown shipwrecks. So we worked out a technique of effectively being able to detect these potentially polluting shipwrecks from space. And then we can go in at a later stage. This is the work of a PhD student of ours from a couple of years ago, Jan Meiker. And Jan was working on creating a computational fluid dynamic model of these shipwreck sites. So effectively modelling the fluid flow around the sites and how that site degrades over time, and then how the contaminants coming from the site are introduced into the water column and where they move to. Another issue we're worried about around the world is deforestation, because forests act as carbon sinks. So if we start to deforest, we start to cut down trees or burn trees, that carbon is then released into the environment, which adds to global climate change. And one of the most famous areas, so the purple areas here, are where deforestation is occurring between 2001 and 2019. One of the most famous areas, of course, is the Amazonian basin, but of course it's happening in every continent on planet Earth. Here's some satellite remote sensing data from NASA in western Brazil, and you can see this characteristic fishbone pattern where the forest has been cleared. So the green areas, the dark green areas, are healthy forests, and these lighter green and browns are where deforestation is occurring. And here's a gorgeous rendition from NASA, and these are just time-lapse satellite data from 2013 to 2018, showing the profound effect of deforestation, forest burning, etc., and how it's clearing the land in the area. We are societally, we like our resources, we like our fancy goods and our fancy products. So we're using geological resources increasingly on planet Earth. And of course, geological resources are non-renewable because they tend to form on geological timescales as opposed to human timescales. So for example, a simple smartphone contains 13 different minerals in the display, electronics, battery and speaker. Where do we get those minerals? We get them from planet Earth. How do we find the minerals? Well, we use geophysics or remote sensing. We use physics to find where these minerals are. So one way of doing this is we can fly sensors on an airplane above planet Earth. You might have seen this in Ireland over the last few years during the summers, etc., when you're outdoors, and you will see a plane flying overhead. And that plane flying overhead, 60 metres over rural areas, 240 metres elevation over urban areas, typically has EM systems on board, gamma ray detectors on board, magnetometers, etc. So it's measuring all of these remotely from that platform flying over the planet, and from that we can derive these magnetic intensity maps, radiometric maps, resistivity maps, etc. of planet Earth, and use these to find where these concentrations of minerals are, and therefore to mine for them more effectively. One example of that is Corrigan-Alt. Some of you might be aware of the gold mines that are have been found in the gold that has been found in the Sperrins, the West Sperrins, over the last few years. And a lot of companies are now doing a lot of exploration work in the area with the intention of extracting gold in this area. And the approach to do this is, of course, we use a lot of satellite and remotely sensed data like this. And we use geological information, and we use sediment stream information, looking at things like concentration of gold, silver, arsenic, copper, lead, zinc, etc. in stream sediments. And we build a model. Effectively, we use a computer to build a model or software to build a model, and then we try and build this type of prospectivity model. And this is the area of West Tyrone here, showing prospectivity model for the West Sperrins. Areas of low prospectivity potential to very high prospectivity potential. This is very interesting to me because I live in this area here near Plum Bridge, and this is shown as an area of sort of high to moderate potential for gold. And so that's what the exploration companies are doing, and they're using, of course, these geophysical data for that. So we're using this remote sensing approach to find where these materials are. One of the sort of materials or the resource that gets very bad press nowadays is hydrocarbons. We use hydrocarbons every day for fuel. The most obvious one is for fuel for cars, etc., but we use it for other reasons as well. So here's for an example of fractional distillation of crude oil. At the bottom of this, we're tapping off bitumen for roads and roofs. So we're using bitumen to build our roads and to weatherproof our roads. We're using fuel oil for ships and power stations, diesel oil for cars, trains, trucks, etc. Kerosene to fuel aircraft, petrol to fuel cars, and gases for domestic heating and cooking. So we're using oil or hydrocarbons at all stages of this. So we need to find these in the first place. So where do we find them? Well, we find them offshore. We find them in the Earth's crust. One way of exploring for this is to use seismic waves. So what we're doing is we're generating seismic waves, getting the seismic waves to propagate through the water column, down into the Earth's crust, to reflect and refract off different horizons in the Earth's crust. And we use this to find where we've got bright spots associated with hydrocarbons in the Earth's crust. Just as an example, this is Ireland, offshore Ireland. All of these red and black straight lines are effectively where companies have gone offshore and explored for hydrocarbons using this technique. And we're extracting a lot of oil and gas here off the south coast of Cork, and at the moment off the west coast of Ireland in terms of the Corrib. Okay. Now we're transitioning from hydrocarbons now towards offshore renewables. So we're also using these techniques to find suitable sites for offshore renewable sites. So traditionally we were doing this in shallow water where we're using monopiles, etc., and putting wind turbines in shallow water. But increasingly we're going further and further offshore. We're putting in offshore floating wind farms which are tethered to the seabed cables and anchors, etc. Okay, one of the problems associated with this is destabilization of these monopiles and cables, etc., at the seabed. So of course we use remote sensing to find suitable sites to put these in, and also to find suitable pathways for the cables to come back on shore or the pipelines to come back on shore, etc. So we're finding suitable routes for the pipelines and cables, we're trenching into the seabed, we're putting our cable on the seabed, and then we're backfilling these trenches, and we're using remote sensing techniques, of course, to establish these pathways. We're also using remote sensing techniques to effectively look at the structural integrity of, say, monopiles on the seabed. So if you think of this as being the base structure of a wind turbine, when the wind turbine is put on the bed, it occupies some of the space. So what happens is the water, the fluid velocity increases around it, and then starts to scour that sediment, immobilize the sediment at the seabed, and scours it away from the base, and then it can act to destabilize the wind turbine. So we do a lot of monitoring work using acoustic remote sensing as well on the seabed. Okay, and just to show you how Ireland needs to change, this is a map from Ireland's Marine Renewable Energy Atlas, and this shows all of the hydrocarbon exploration areas in Ireland over the last few years. Okay, the exclusive economic zone of Ireland is shown by this red polygon here. So incidentally, the seabed that Ireland owns effectively, or that has to manage, is 7 times the land area. Okay, and a lot of our resources are offshore. So that's the hydrocarbons we've been looking at over the last 10, 20, 30, 40 years in Ireland versus the amount of renewables we're using offshore. So Ireland is a laggard in this sense. We're way behind the rest of Europe in terms of our offshore renewables. So we're playing catch up. That's good news for our students, because our students are going out now and getting jobs in these companies which are trying to choose and trying to pick suitable sites for the offshore renewables and also for the infrastructure coming back on land. So here's an example from a recent report in the Irish Times. The first large wind farm off the west coast is among 4 offshore energy auction winners. Okay, and there are big plans in Ireland now to develop all up along the east coast and along the west coast, and indeed the north coast and the south coast in terms of offshore renewables. But one of the big problems with engineering our seabed, of course, is that the engineering infrastructure on our seabed then comes open to change and forcing from natural sources and also from anthropogenic forcing. So if we look at a map of the internet cables across the seabed throughout the world, it's quite profound. The seabed is now engineered in a way we never would have thought possible. Okay, so this is a map of cables on the seabed carrying the internet from one country or one continent to the other. Okay, and here's an example of the infrastructure on the seabed just in the North Sea, bringing oil and gas from Norway down through the North Sea into Britain, into Scotland, into England, into Netherlands, etc., etc. So there are pipelines and there are cables strewn across the seabed throughout the entire world. Okay, some of those are open to change because as the energy of the oceans gets higher and higher, so we're getting more and more energy in the oceans because of climate change, and it can act to destabilize a lot of this infrastructure on the seabed. So we need to monitor this destabilization, and we use acoustic remote sensing to do that. Here's an example of a gas pipeline gone into free span. So you can see all the sediment underneath that has been scoured out. Eventually gravity will take over if intervention doesn't take place there. The pipeline will collapse and then all of those hydrocarbons will escape into the marine environment. Okay, so we need to be very careful about that. But also we've got other actors on the planet Earth which are causing problems in terms of this engineering infrastructure. One of the most famous ones recently is where we've got the Nord Stream pipeline coming down through the Baltic, feeding gas from Russia into European states. And this has been interfered with. A lot of people seem to be pointing the finger towards Russia and the interference of this. So of course we're having to use acoustic remote sensing to monitor these sites and try and mitigate this type of interference. And one of the big ones that nations are becoming more and more aware of is that other nations interfering with their data on the seabed, because all of these cables carry data and carry the internet, etc., around the world. So it's well known that the Russian Navy and the Russian naval forces have been mapping all of this infrastructure at great detail for the last, say, 5-10 years, and they now have very, very accurate maps of where all this infrastructure is, and therefore potentially it's open to them tapping into these, or indeed just snipping them, etc., etc. So it's an area which I never would have thought 25 years ago when I started working in this area that we would be getting jobs, or our students would be getting jobs in this area, but they are. Okay, so final issue, societal issue. The global population is increasing all the time. We need to feed them, and one way of feeding them is to give them protein. Okay, and the problem is, of course, over the last few years, we're fishing more and more. We're becoming more clever at how we fish, and therefore we're fishing out stocks. We're fishing stocks closer. The stocks that are close to land are easier to get, and we fish those out readily. So we're moving further and further offshore to try and get more and more protein. And of course, in the past, fishery stock assessments were done using nets, and it was very time consuming. We were having to take these catch on board, measure all the catch, etc. Nowadays, fishery stock assessments are being done by nations using acoustics. So we're using acoustic remote sensing sources. This is an example of acoustics over herring shoals, and we can actually measure from the intensity of the signals we're getting not only the volume of herring that are here, but also the density of herring that are here, and therefore we can do our fishery stock assessments using acoustic remote sensing techniques, and we can target different species in terms of commercial exploitation as well. And this is one example of something called a boarfish, a species called boarfish, which was targeted over the last few years in Ireland as a commercial species. But of course, we knew very little about boarfish, so we had to do some investigations initially to work out what boarfish were, what they looked like in terms of acoustics, and therefore how we could use acoustics to do fishery stock assessment before deciding how much tonnage of boarfish we could take out of the system. That's what a boarfish looks like in real life, and this is what it looks like in a MRI. So this is a magnetic resonance imaging scan of a boarfish, and the reason we would do this is we're interested in actually this is the swim bladder in the boarfish, okay, and it's the swim bladder that gives us the return in our acoustics when we're using acoustic remote sensing. So it's the boundary between the swim bladder and the fleshy component of the fish that actually gives us a reflection or a scattering from the fish. So we use magnetic resonance imaging to basically build up a model, a three-dimensional model of the swim bladder, and then we know what it should look like when we insonify it in the acoustic remote sensing data. And these are the results that the Marine Institute down south did in terms of the boarfish surveys a couple of years ago. So everywhere you got these red and green hits is where you've got boarfish, and they've done that using acoustic remote sensing. They've gone out and they surveyed, and they've got all the return from the boarfish. The bigger the circles, the higher the density of boarfish. So you can see there's a lot of boarfish in the system, and these have since been targeted as a commercial species. So what do our students that are graduating from Ulster, what kind of careers do they develop, and what kind of skills do they develop? Well, the skills they develop are started in first year in terms of remote sensing and using physics effectively to map planet Earth. There's a module called EGM 101 Skills Toolbox. In second year, they do a module called GIS and Remote Sensing, EGM 310. And then in final year, they do a module called Advanced GIS and Remote Sensing. So they develop skills the whole way through their degree in order to get careers in this area. And it's amazing the amount of people who are getting careers directly out of their degree in this area. And here's a couple of examples. This is Craig Dyer, who graduated with a BSc in Marine Science in 2011 from us. And Craig is now party chief with Fugro, the largest underwater survey company in the world. And he's working on projects mainly updating all of the Admiralty charts from all around the world using acoustic remote sensing techniques. Gail McAleese graduated with a degree in environmental science from us in 2011, and she now works with Gavin and Doherty Geosolutions down south, working mainly, as her profile shows on LinkedIn, on offshore wind farms. Okay, so Gail is a geophysicist. She's a senior geophysicist with GDG down south, and she's working predominantly on wind farms, but has worked in the past on hydrocarbon installations, etc. And finally, here's an example of Matty McCready, graduated BSc in Geography in 2012. And Matty now works with critical national infrastructure with Esri, who are a massive GIS company, he's based in Britain now. So he's working on critical national infrastructure projects associated with cables and pipelines, etc. around the world. So just three examples of our graduates and what they've ended up doing. So the take-home message, I suppose, is we need to produce STEM graduates with skills to understand, measure and model these complex Earth systems. So we're asking you to please send us your students, your physics, your maths, your chemistry, your biology students. Send them to us for the degrees in environmental science and marine science, and we will train them up in these areas, and then they will hopefully get a really rewarding career and a job in this aspect. So thank you very much for listening today. It was my pleasure to try and introduce some of these sort of concepts, I suppose, and some of the stuff that our students are being exposed to into degrees. Okay, thanks very much, folks, and hopefully chat to some of you in the sessions later.